Well, this is a big week for Major League Baseball with the annual All-Star Game coming up on Tuesday night and available on Fox UP. That means there's no better time to talk baseball and no better way to talk baseball than with someone who has played the game. It starts right now.
From TV6, this is The Ryan Report. Now, here's your host, Don Ryan.
Well, John Hiller was a pitcher who spent his entire career with the Detroit Tigers. He had success as a starter and even more as a reliever. He was part of the Tigers' World Championship team and also selected to be part of an All-Star team. Hiller wasn't just another pitcher. His outstanding career with the Tigers includes 87 wins, 125 saves, at a time when saves weren't an everyday happening. He had a career ERA of 2.83 and pitched 1,242 innings. This morning I want to get his take on the current Detroit Tigers, get some insights into the game from a pitcher's perspective, and talk about some memories from the past. John, it's a real pleasure to welcome you back to the Ryan Report.
Okay, great, Don. It's good to see you again.
You know, before we talk baseball, you know, the last time we were here, you talked about how you got from Ontario to Detroit. But I didn't ask you how you got from Detroit to Iron Mountain, where you live now, or in the Iron Mountain area. How did that come about?
Well, I've got a little time. I'll try and shorten the story. My wife was from Duluth, Minnesota. So we wintered in Duluth, which in itself is not a very smart thing to do, up in the cold. But I only stayed in Detroit for the season, rented an apartment, moved around a little bit, and then headed to Duluth, Minnesota. When I retired, I had no idea what I was 38 years old and didn't make a lot of money back then, so I know I had to go to work. I tried insurance. That didn't work out. Worked for Lutheran Brotherhood. Had a family pet store. Family would help out. We'd do that. It was called Hiller's Critters, just on the edge of the UMD campus. Did that for a couple years. I'm not a very good businessman. I always used to say a pretty lady or a little kid come in, I'd pretty much give the store away. So anyways, I came over to Felch. Somebody invited me over. I'd never heard of Felch. They play the Labor Day tournament.
Right.
And enjoyed that weekend with my family. We stayed at a hunting camp, came back for bird season, came back for deer season, and I don't know, I'm still that way. My family at the time was that way. My kids are that way. Just we'll up and do something crazy. And I went back. My daughters had horses back in Minnesota, and I said, I found a farm. Would you all like to move to the UP? They said, sure, let's try something different. It wasn't quite that quick, but so we came over. I hauled animals from Minnesota and milk cow. We had a little more like a hobby farm for a couple years, and found out that cost a lot of money also. And I went to work for Peninsula Beverage. So anyway, that's about basically how I got to the UP.
And you kind of winter away from here, but you do spend summers here.
Yeah, and that's just, I've been here since 1982. And just 8 years ago, we purchased a place in Arizona for the winters, and got a few health problems. It's just can't deal with the cold anymore.
Speaking of that, and we also talked about this before, but you had a heart attack when you were 27 years old. In fact, I think you had 3.
I had 3 that one morning, January 11th.
And you didn't even realize there were heart attacks at first because you think, well, I'm 27 years old. I'm not going to have a heart attack.
Yeah, that partly, and I had previously had pneumonia 4 or 5 years back, and chest pain with that, so it just seems similar. And like you said, 27, who's to think about heart attacks?
And I was reading where, as you were recovering, they gave you some intestinal bypass surgery, which at that time was kind of an experimental thing to kind of help you lose weight.
It was, and doctor out of Minnesota, Dr. Buchwald, and Henry Buchwald, and he was doing the large bypass for obese people, but his idea was if he would do a partial bypass, along with nutrition, exercise, quit smoking, of course, and that he thought he could reverse the disease. And he'd had it where he'd stopped it before, but 6 months later, both my blockages were totally reversed.
Really?
And cholesterol went from close to 300 down to 93, which is extremely low. So I guess the ironic thing, it's never happened since. He'd never after that had a complete reversal So I feel the good Lord was looking out for me and got me back into baseball a year and a half later.
And did you have to make any other lifestyle changes?
Just diet and quit drinking, quit smoking, which at that time, growing up in the 60s, I think drinking's always been a part of sports when you're
Right.
out for the evening and you're traveling. And I would say more than half our team smoked back in the 60s. So
Sure, yeah.
it was just part of the culture, I guess. So those weren't easy to, or weren't difficult to correct back then when you know that. And I wasn't thinking about my life as much as my career. Uneducated, unskilled, 2 children, and had to find a way to support them. So that was my motivation to get back to baseball.
And motivated you were because you, of course, missed the 71 season, came back in 72, but in 1973, you logged 125 innings, you lowered your ERA to 1.44, and set an American League record with 38 saves.
Yes.
You received the Comeback Player of the Year award, the Hutch Award, and the Fireman of the Year award. So you came back, no question, you came back.
Yeah, and who's to know? That was never expected. I mean, I was just sort of a average left-handed pitcher that could throw strikes, and that was basically what my role was. And to come back like that, and Billy Martin almost put me right in immediately into a closer role, and that's when they did start. You started seeing more saves in the ball games, and pretty much did that until 1980 when my career ended.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in just a couple of minutes. Back with more on the Ryan Report after we take a short break. We're talking this morning with John Hiller, one of the greatest relief pitchers in the history of the Detroit Tigers. Before we leave the health issue, I did want to mention that I know you have been involved in the Beacon House project.
Mm-hmm.
You've been very supportive. You were part of the golf tournament recently. But you actually have a little history with Beacon House.
Yeah, Don, I was, I don't know, quite a few years ago, we're golfing in Iron Mountain, and it was a couples tournament. I think it was a scramble, and playing with another couple. And we just made this little turn to go to the ladies' tee box. My wife fell out, happened to hit her temple right on the concrete. And she was knocked out immediately, started bleeding. Her eye almost even blood came out. So ambulance came up the golf course. Next thing you know, we're in the hospital on Iron Mountain. Doctor came out and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Hiller, we can't treat her. Her brain's starting to swell." And your mind's going, wait, we were just golfing,
Sure, right.
So it wasn't like I was out there going all over the place. So we had ambulance heads up here, and I tried to follow them. They lost me. I was real fast. I get to the hospital, and they checked her in, and very close to having to drill in and relieve the pressure. Last minute, no. Well, then she came to a bit, and first thing she says, "John, did we win a skin?" And so I says, "Honey, I'm not sure," but I didn't have any place to stay. You run out, didn't have any toiletries or clothes or anything, and people said, "Well, the Beacon House might have a room." Told me where it was, told me what it was all about, and I spent a couple nights there. And even before Steve started to do this tournament, Steve and Jay. I was in full support of anything I could have done for the Beacon House.
And the story that you've told is common with hundreds of people who have experienced the same thing.
I'm sure.
Let's talk about baseball. This is All-Star Game Week. You were on an All-Star team.
Yes.
What's that atmosphere like? Is it exciting for the players?
I don't know if it's changed. All I can do is back, for me, being the first one, maybe about halfway through my career, and never ever expecting to be on an all-star team. That was a thrill and an honor. And all of a sudden, Al Kaline from our team was there, and I'm not even sure if Mickey Lolich was there or not. But looking at the best players in our league and then the best players in the National League, and for that one period or that 1 year or that one weekend, you're a part of that. You're one of the best. And I think after I left there, it sort of hits you that way, just saying that at this moment in time, you're one of the best players in baseball, and surrounded by best players in baseball.
And
so.
even though there's obviously competition, and sometimes there are some issues between players, generally there is kind of a camaraderie, isn't there?
Oh, of course there is.
Yeah.
Yes, it's just that way. All of a sudden, you have one motive, and that's to win that ball game. And I like what they've done. Some of the changes in baseball I don't like, but I like what they've done as far as making this game very important for home field advantage. Other sports, in hockey, they don't want to board or hurt anybody. Football, they don't tackle. Basketball, they score almost 300 points. I mean, so it's just a stage for the best. But baseball, it's actually a very important game.
Let's talk about the Tigers. This is the time of the year when, at least in this era, people look at their team and decide if they're a contender or not.
Yeah. Do we have to?
Which means they become. I'm a big Tiger fan, and obviously you are.
Yeah.
What about our Tigers this year?
Starting the season, I thought our weakness was just going to be the bullpen. Of course, we had a couple injuries early, and that's always part of the game. Martinez and that. The pitching's just not there right now. Right. Verlander struggling. It's just not there. The bullpen is doing it about 5 years in a row. They're just not doing the job.
What happens? We've got both Jordan Zimmermann and Verlander. Both have excellent histories. What happens to pitchers like that? We hear commentators talk about mechanics and other things. What's really going on?
Yeah, I don't know. My theory with Verlander, and he probably won't see this program, and he won't like me, and I've got to go down to Detroit in a few weeks, but I just think he reverts back to a thrower. When he gets in some trouble and has a bad inning or something, he doesn't pitch anymore. And he just rears back and throws a ball, whether it's a curveball, slider, fastball. He's just rearing back. Now, he hasn't had a changeup all year, and that was always a big part of his pitching. But I see that he's not. He used to be able to throw the ball on the corners, on the edges, up and in, low and away. And now I think he's rearing back. Plus, when you're getting a little older, he's probably even got the velocity there, just short of 100 at times. But you don't get that little extra pop at the end. And when he was doing it early in his career, he'd throw that pitch by him. Now they're following it off. And I mean, he had 100 pitches the other day in 4 innings.
Right.
I mean, that's unheard of. And he didn't have a strikeout. First time in 3,000 or something innings or 300 games or something like that. So.
What about a guy like K-Rod, Francisco Rodriguez? Outstanding history. Did decent for the Tigers last year. Just couldn't do it this year.
Yeah.
You just lose it all of a sudden.
Well, I was really surprised last year that he did so well. You look around the league, most of the closers are power pitchers. They throw hard. There's very few. K-Rod couldn't hit 90. And if he did it once in a while, it was 89 miles an hour with a little curveball or slider and then a great changeup. He did. But those guys can sit on the changeup and adjust. If he was throwing 95, 96, then they can't sit on that changeup. But he's throwing 89. So they can almost look for the changeup and still adjust with that fastball. Mm-hmm. And I think he lost his control with the fastball. If he's nipping the corners with that fastball, then he probably can get by with it. But once he gets close to the center of the plate, there's just nothing there. And we really don't live. Wilson is doing okay now, but whether he's the answer or not, I don't know. But they just can't maintain that fellow that goes out there and only maybe gives up 3 games a year, 4 games a year at max. When you're losing in the 9th inning, that just leaves such a bad taste in the whole team.
We have to take one more break. Back with some more questions for John after we take this commercial break. We won't go into detail again on player pay, but I did a little study just for the fun of it. And Hal Newhouser in 1947 pitched 272 innings, had 19 complete games, and that meant he was paid $202 per inning. Justin Verlander in 2014 was paid $20 million, and that came out to be $97,000 per inning pitched. Quite a difference, huh? Let me ask you about Bill Freehan was an all-star catcher.
Yes.
How important is the catcher to the pitcher? Obviously, he has to catch the ball, but does it make a difference?
I believe it makes a big difference. If you see a pitcher out there and a catcher and the pitcher's shaking his head all the time, then he's not going to have a good game. If I could go out there and pitch 2 or 3 innings and never shake my head, then chances are I'm going to pitch a good ball game. Bill's there every day. Catcher's there pretty much every day. He knows the batters. He knows my strength. He knows my weakness. And I try to go along with him, 100% if I can. There's going to be an instance where he thinks something and I really don't feel comfortable throwing that pitch, then I'm going to shake him off. I have the last word. Pitcher has the last word. But the way you call a game, the way, they talk so much about how you receive a ball and how they catch the ball and everything, and they talk about framing it, which we didn't talk about that per se, but he did that same thing. So from that standpoint, that's why a lot of times, Don, they'll have a catcher that maybe only hit 220, but he handles the pitching staff very well. He's a great thrower. He does everything else well defensively, and so they give up the bat just because that's so important.
Which is why it's great to have a guy like Freehan.
It is.
We have only a few minutes left. Let's talk about managers. I'm not jumping on the get rid of Brad Ausmus bandwagon yet, but you played for some interesting managers, Mayo Smith, Billy Martin, Ralph Houck. Any favorites in that group?
Well, favorite, men-wise, Ralph Houck, by far. He was just a great person to play with. He would be almost like a Jimmy Leyland.
Okay.
Old school, go out there and give 100%. And if you want to stay out an hour past curfew, then come and tell me. He wanted to treat everybody like men, and he wanted you to act like men. So he was just almost a father figure to so many. Billy Martin, a little crazy and wild, but he was a great motivator. The people that didn't like him, he could motivate them too. And players that did like him, he was just a great motivator on the ball. Great once the game started.
What is the most important thing a manager does, or what are the couple of most important things? Is the leadership or is it making up the lineup or changes during the game? What really? I
think, especially this day and age with the money everybody's making. A lot of our motivation back then was to have a good year to get a raise. People said, well, you guys didn't play for money. Well, that's just because we didn't have any, but of course we were playing for money. And nowadays, they don't worry about having a good game to have a good year to get a raise that much. They just a status symbol. So I think keeping the players happy is the big thing with the manager. And I think that's why they went out and got an Ausmus. He probably took a little psychology in school, college educated, and being able to handle people, being an ex-catcher. And I think that's the most important thing, is keeping everybody as much happy as you can. You got to play everybody a little bit. I think Ausmus does a good job with that, getting in the extra guys and filling in, and then when you need them, when somebody gets hurt, that they're more prepared. But I think that's the most important. Everybody knows how to do. You could manage a baseball game as far as when to bunt and when to hit and run. And bringing a pitcher in, probably when to take him out and who to bring in, is probably the functional thing that's the most difficult.
We have only 10 seconds. Should they keep him or get somebody else?
Well, I'm not going to say they should get rid of him. It's never usually the manager's fault, and I think they like him. I think that they might make a move, because you can't get rid of 8 or 9 players. Right. So many times it's getting rid of the manager or the coach, and I wouldn't be surprised, unless we win 7, 8 games in a row, I wouldn't be surprised to see him gone at the All-Star break.
I wish we had a lot more time, John, but we don't have any more. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it very much.
Okay, Don. Thank you.
Okay. Well, our conversation this morning about baseball put me in a nostalgic mood. That seems to occur more frequently lately. But today I can't help but drift back to a time many years ago when I was about 10 or 11 years old, sitting in my bedroom listening to the Tigers baseball game on my little table radio. Some great former broadcasters like Harry Heilman and Van Patrick kept my ears glued to the radio as they described the on-field actions of players like Vic Wertz, Johnny Groth, and Hoot Evers, or the pitching magic of Virgil Fire Trucks. The announcers on radio had that ability to paint a picture of the game that made you feel you were there watching it. But it was more than about listening to the games on radio. It was about playing the game, but in a very different era. You know, growing up in Ishpeming, as the snow melted and summer arrived, my friends and I played baseball almost every day. But it was very different from today. We were very much into sports, and that's what occupied most of our time. Baseball in the summer, football in the fall, and basketball in the winter. I think one of the reasons we had so much fun is because we organized our own games. We didn't have Little League or any baseball league, didn't have uniforms or umpires, didn't have a schedule. We just played when we felt like it, which was almost all the time. Sometimes we'd play all day long and then go down to the playgrounds and watch the men's fast-pitch softball league at night. We had our own playing fields, not always regulation size, in the neighborhood and around town. For smaller games, we'd use a ball you couldn't hit very far and play on the corner by our house. That diamond wasn't perfect and did have some problems. The streets ran downhill in two directions, which often meant chasing the ball a long way. Back then, Cleveland Cliffs had a parking lot near their main office on Spruce Street. That was one of our favorite fields on the weekend when it wasn't being used. There were large lilac bushes around the perimeter of the lot, so in our minds, we were playing in Wrigley Field. As we got into our teenage years, we started playing with kids from other parts of town. They were still just pickup games. We called ourselves the Bancroft Lakers because that's the neighborhood we lived in, and one of our fields was by the lake. When fall came around, we started playing touch football, usually in the street. We had some pretty spirited games and, of course, a lot of arguments about whether or not we had actually been touched. It seems like that kind of play is something we've lost. Back then, we didn't have television or video games or computers or social media, so we made up our own games. We were just kids playing and having a good time. I guess times were simpler then, maybe safer then, and in my mind, lots of fun for kids, just being kids, having a good time with each other. I can't change the way things are today, so I'm glad I have the memories of how things used to be. I'll be back in a minute. We're moments away from the Today Show. Still time to remind you that if you miss our show, you can also catch it on the internet at uppermichigansource.com. The latest edition should be there afternoon tomorrow. Past editions are available right now. Well, as a longtime Detroit Tiger fan, it was great talking with John Hiller this morning. Maybe the Tigers should bring him back as the closer in the second half of the season. Thank you for joining us. Look forward to meeting you again next Sunday morning.